Okay, so I want to discuss what Elon Musk's doppelgangers prove about genetics. Okay, because I mentioned in another video that I don't have a black nose. Okay, because this nose could be found in these sort of other populations with these different genetic subfrequencies. Okay, yet when it's on my face, just because it's in combination with these other features, it suddenly becomes a black nose. But when it's on their nose, or when it's on their face, it's just a nose. Maybe it's a bigger nose, a bolder nose, or people will assume that they are admixed with black identified people. Okay, but what I mean is, so if you look at these Elon Musk doppelgangers, but also these doppelgangers from other, you know, random people or other sort of famous people, um, they have the same facial features. Like a lot of these Elon Musk doppelgangers, some look like identical to Elon Musk, but they're from different genetic subfrequencies. Okay, so that means that a white nose doesn't exist. That means that a European nose doesn't exist, or whatever sort of specific sort of cultural origins or tribes Elon Musk is from, that nose for those populations don't exist. Okay, because they're from different genetic subfrequencies, but they have the same nose. So it means those noses don't exist from either population, and that means that there isn't a sort of Asian nose or Chinese nose and that type of thing because they have the same nose. Okay, so one thing that proves is that um, that proves that race doesn't exist. Okay, because you guys, some people, you know, justify race because there's these distinct or exclusive features found in these populations, but these doppelgangers prove that these features are found in um, various populations. So that sort of connects with how we say like we're 99.9% genetically similar, or how they say something like you can find genetic similarity. Like two people can from completely different sort of tribes or genetic subfrequencies can be more genetically similar than people within those same tribes or genetic subfrequencies, which these doppelgangers kind of prove that. And then another thing is it shows like some people are still clinging to that, sort of um, based uh, skull based racialization. But one, it shows like first of all, we already see that sort of very similar skulls can be found in different genetic subfrequencies. But it also shows that people sort of exaggerate what the skull's impact on people's appearance because these doppelgangers be looking uh, very similar. So they either have to have like pretty much the same skull shape, or the skull shapes don't really have that big of an impact on appearance as we try to um, present. But again, this is showing that there's no such thing as like white features or black features. Like people will be like black hair, black nose. There's no such thing as a black nose or black hair, this, that, and the fourth. Um, because for there to be like a black nose, that nose would have to be exclusively found in these black identified people. But these doppelgangers prove that there's features aren't exclusively found in these identified populations. So there's no such thing as a black nose. Or like how people say Asian eyes. There's no such thing as Asian eyes. Okay? Because those emphatic eyes, those monolid eyes, are found in a lot of different sort of distinct tribes or genetic subfrequencies. So, one, that's the reason why there can't be Asian eyes. And then because these interrelated historical populations have a higher concentration of this sort of specific or distinct feature, and they have been within this sort of made up territorial boundary, we call them Asian eyes. That just means that there's interrelated tribes with a concentration of a feature. And because those interrelated populations, current and historical, are also concentrated in a made up territorial boundary we call Asia, we're calling them Asian eyes. That doesn't make sense. There's no such thing as Asian eyes. Okay, but then to backtrack a little bit, it's like, so, right, they could share features like these doppelgangers. They, if we sort of go far enough, they have these sort of shared, they originated from the same sort of populations, right? But then that still shows that we haven't been sort of distant and isolated enough to become these sort of different races. Okay, because you're still carrying like these doppelgangers sort of kind of either come out that you're sharing genes, right? So there was a population, and then that population sort of split. People split from that population, or that population split, and they carried the same genes. And then sometimes they sort of come up to the surface in a sense, right? These other features sort of average out through because of intermarriage, but those genes are still, those similar genes that they carried are still sort of in that pool in a sense. And sometimes they come to the surface, and then we get those doppelgangers from different genetic subfrequencies. But then again, that proves that there isn't, we're not distant enough from each other. We're not different uh, races. Or it's a case where it is different genes, but it is different genes, but they can still produce the same features, which just reinforces that that still means we're sort of working from the same sort of material. So that there's no, you can't label a feature as black or Asian or this or that. It's just a Gaian feature. Okay, because again, people will be like, I know people identify it or assume like this. It's a black nose to them, right? But technically or naturally, like I have origins from white, brown, and black identified people. I believe that's pretty much what it is. There's a white identified people, brown identified people, and black identified people. Okay. And then these so-called populations, even with a population, some could fit into all three. Like we say that there's like this American Indian population. I'm saying that there's some white identified Amerindians, some brown identified Amerindians, and some Amerindians are practically black identified. Very brown skin, bold features, right? Um, type of thing. But I have origins from, but then there's, again, populations from all, like there's, anyways, I have origins from white identified people, brown identified people, and black identified people. This nose could have came from one of my white identified originators or one of my brown identified originators. People assume that it's from one of my black identified originators. That could be most like more a higher chance of that happening, but there's no way of knowing that. Because as we can see with these doppelgangers, populations with different genetic subfrequencies can have the same features and traits. So this nose could be from some of my white identified originators. This nose could be from um, some of my brown um, uh, originators. It could be from some of my black identified originators, and then even then, it just keeps going because a lot of our people take these sort of identifiers, these color coding identification, as kind of literal sometimes, but a lot of my black identified originators were sort of admixed, right? Um, from these sort of distant historical migrations and that sort of thing, right? If you look at the sort of average Fulani tribe member, they migrated into West Africa from like an area more towards northeastern Africa, and they admixed there, okay, with these sort of white identified, I guess, Arab speaking people, and you know, then I have some Fulani originators due to the industrial kidnapping complex, the modern industrial kidnapping complex. So that could be from one of them, or it could even become from some of these other white identified people. You don't know that. But then, even then, there is no such thing as a black nose because there's no there's there's no feature that's exclusive to black identified people. Like you kind of know what you're juggling, these sort of stereotypes and cast coding and that type of thing where you're like, yeah, you kind of know when you're saying black identified. First of all, it doesn't even make sense because it's like not just genetically, it's just sensically it doesn't make sense because you're like, oh, they have a black nose. But if it was a black nose, every single black identified person would have that nose. I could see if it was like maybe two or three distinct nose types and that was it. But there's so many noses. You can find every type of nose in black identified people, so it makes no sense just to say that someone has a black nose. What you guys are really typically saying is a nose that was concentrated in populations that lived the concentrated in populations that lived in West Africa um, in the like 17th and 18th centuries, right? There's this sort of stereotype that's based on or around the modern industrial kidnapping complex, where that's where they kind of just base it on, right? But that so-called nose, like it's usually like a wider triangular type of nose. My nose is a little like that, but it's a little different. But first of all, that still doesn't make sense. But then that nose isn't exclusively found in a tribe or a population. And then these tribes and populations are just social constructs and theoretical constructs and imaginary like lines and constructs. Because then for people to say that, people are still treating like there are no clear cut isolated tribes. Because and people will even say like West African features. Again, that doesn't make sense, not even on a sensical level, because West Africa is just a region. There's several there's populations with several different origins, appearances, cultures that live in West Africa, and then you're saying West African feature. Like, yeah, you can kind of figure out what they're saying based on like this sort of limited, biased stereotype, I guess you could say. But even then, that doesn't make sense genetically because there is no, like, let's say something more specific, like, oh, just randomly, let's say like a Samoan look. That doesn't make sense because there's no isolated tribe, there's no pure tribe. So it's impossible to, it doesn't make sense to say, point to a tribe and say that there's that tribal feature, not just because of all these other reasons, but because there's no pure tribe. So how could you say, like, it just doesn't make sense. It's kind of like labeling a cloud something, a specific term, like that's a wawala, but clouds merge with other clouds, they're constantly moving. It just doesn't make sense because there's no, like we're saying it with this definite certainty, pure isolated thing, but that's not how that thing works. Like, because first there's a part where it's like when someone's like, I have Cherokee heritage or I have a Cherokee grandparent. They were, yes, maybe they were a member of the Cherokee tribe, because again, tribes are just membership based. They're not these literal genetic things. Because there's that thing where it's like, um, Cherokee people, like, let's just using them as an example. When there was warfare, sometimes they would bring in captives from other tribes, from that tribe that they fought. And that person would be integrated in the tribe and they would have a union with them and they have a child. Or sometimes they wouldn't kill younger people or children, kind of orphaned, right? And they would take that orphaned tribe person and integrate them in the tribe. When they grew up, they would have a union and they would have a child. And then there's, you know how there's a language family, like, let me check, like there's a Cherokee language, but it's a, you know, a branch of a sort of higher, or a bubble, I'll call it Iraqian. Okay, so these Cherokee people, members, tribe, they had unions with, say, maybe like Mohawk people or the Nottoway. It was not totally. It, tribes have unions from tribes. It's not totally uncommon for them to have unions with people from tribes of closely related languages. And then there's unions with tribes with completely different dynamic languages and are distinct genetics, right? Those typically heavily correlate, right? Right. We saw that like in ancient times, there was like these Polynesian inhabitants, these blue Polynesian inhabitants went to South America. We found DNA, right? that they're admixed. They were from completely different language families. So when you're calling that person Cherokee in that sort of um, isolated way, it's not true. That person could be, that Cherokee great grandparent could have been admixed with all these different things, but then you're just calling them Cherokee because they were a member of the Cherokee tribe. Okay, so then what is it? But then people will say like a Cherokee nose. What is a Cherokee nose if there's not sort of a pure Cherokee person? What's a Cherokee nose then? What if that nose is influenced from these other distinct genes or even genetic subfrequencies? You know what I'm saying? Like there was even shown that like there was like those X haplogroups found in some sort of Amerindian identified populations. So what you're calling like, there's features that are carried from other places, but you guys are calling it Amerindian or Chinese or black or white or European or African when it doesn't make sense. Because there is just no pure tribe. Like even look at like something like those Sentinelese inhabitants, right? They've been isolated for a really long time on Sentinelese Island, and they have probably a very distinct genetic pattern and that type of thing, distinct culture, but it's not a pure Sentinelese identified culture because we always originate from something else. What I mean is, so those people had to have split from some other tribe or tribes, and then traveled into that island and became isolated. So if there's like a Sentinelese language, they are right. They probably formed this new Sentinelese language, these new words and everything, but they probably are still speaking this spattering of words that they carried from that tribe or tribes that they originated from. Right? We can make something up. Like let's say there's like a Walala tribe, and this Walala tribe travels to an island, and this Dodola island. Okay, and they become these Dodola people, and they create this Dodola language. Well, they're still going to be speaking Bubula words, and maybe even doing some cultural expressions, recipes, rituals, you know, and they're going to take that sort of Bubula genetic things that we identify, that Bubula identified genes are still going to be in there too. Even if all these hundreds of years pass, where they could develop this new distinct genetic pattern, there's still going to be those sort of sprinkles from those things. There's no pure tribe, but that's how we approach it with our language and our practices and that type of thing. Oh, they're Asian, they're Chinese, they're Italian, they're Yoruba. It's like, not really. It's a lot more fluid. It's a lot more nebulous. It's a lot more spectral. Okay, but that's not how we sort of talk about it. And then that comes down to you know dissolving this concept of race and these other sort of you know identifiers, which are just starting to come off as um, not just casteist or phobic or sinister. It's just that they are tracking tags, they're tracking collars. Like people are really like, particularly black, it's very sort of sticky. What I mean is, it's like when someone has like afro textured hair, people are like, why do they look black or black hair? But when there's other populations with like, blue eyes, which are like white coated, you rarely hear like, why do they have white eyes? It's like people are very sort of concerned or even worried about tracking black identified people or genes, right? Which is just sort of, but they do the same thing for white identified, but it's typically they want to track white coded features or genes in a more desirable way. Sometimes, sometimes it is in an avoidant way, or sometimes they want to, or phobic way, and then sometimes, but typically it's more they want to track something black identified to, you know, in a phobic way, in an avoidant way, or people are very worried about tracking black identified genes or people, or release people or features because you're anticipating danger. You're using black as a proxy for dangerous. That's what we do sometimes. Um, like sometimes you look at a person like, are they black? And what you're really going through is like, how dangerous are they going to be? Which is just, castus, which is just, that means like, this is a good sign that you've been, programmed, right? Caste propaganda, um, cult propaganda, that type of thing. And it's also, shows casteism and that type of thing. It even gets into that, similar to where people are like talking about black identity and their fast twitch muscles and sinewy fibers and how dense they are. It's like if you have to dissect someone like a frog, there's some phobia there. There's some worry there. There's some fear there. It's like, can we bring in the microscope, bring in the magnifying glasses? Uh, we're Gaian people. That's what we are. Um, we're all Gaian people. We adapt and change to our environment, and we adapt and change. That's like the Gaian way, and that's all what this is. But then I'm not going to sort of pretend like, just from like a North American perspective, I do think there's like a correlation with, um like, even saying all that, I'm not gonna pretend like there's not correlations. I do think there's multiple types of intelligences, and that these intelligence concentrations and these intelligences are found in every population, just in different concentrations. But I'm not gonna pretend like there's not a correlation with these, I guess, different types of intelligence and appearances. Yes, so, but one, and two is like they're not exclusive to those appearances. I mean, oversimplifying it, overgeneralizing it will make our sort of discriminatory navigation easier and more manageable, but it's not true. And then, like, I'm not going to pretend like, and then that just doesn't make sense, because it's like, I mean, that was never going to make sense because we've been admixing in a sense for a while. And like, there's no, people say white person, like, there's this pure population, or black people, like, there's this pure population where they have this like mono genes or homogenous flat genes or profile, and it's just not the case. But then I also not there's a correlation with appearances with, say, like poverty or crime, but that's one, um, more due to societal structure, and um, just because there's a correlation doesn't mean that it's exclusive. It's certain. It's a fact. Okay, because it's like when people sort of discriminate against black identified people, some black identified people sort of play the mayor, play the victim, like where is this coming from? No, black identified people have a very high sort of have black identified people have higher rates of poverty, uh, and higher rates of poverty and prison rates, and higher rates of, I would say, street crime, which is perceived as more, you know, dangerous. But that again is not exclusive. It's not. There's also millions. There's also millions of black identified millionaires, and higher income, all facets of life. Okay, so what what does that mean? And then um so it's just a it's this so basically these color coded tags are tracking tags. They're tracking collars, but they're not even functional. They're not even reliable. And it's kind of focusing on the wrong things. Like if we put more energy into sort of reforming society and these societal structures instead of trying to track and control people based on like nonsensical constructs and concepts as illustrated by the earlier video, then we wouldn't feel the need to track each other or control each other, which is sort of futile. We can't. It was a poor sort of a misguided, short-sighted, whatever you want to say, endeavor to try to control each other, to try to control nature. It's basically impossible.